Thank you. Order, order. We now move on to the next debate. Julian, study to move the motion. I'll tell you the rules now. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Move the debate to be heard on free childcare provision and nursery providers. Mr Bone, it is a privilege to serve under your chairmanship today.
Could members leave the chamber quietly, please? Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr Bone. As I was saying, it is a privilege to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon for what I think is the first time, and to bring forward this debate. As was made clear, Mr Bone, in the recent Queen's speech, the government is bringing forward measures to help working people by increasing the provision of free childcare. This is clearly a very welcomed announcement to many people up and down the country and in my constituency, as I believe it provides us with a great opportunity to launch a full review of childcare funding. As members may be aware, Mr Bone, I previously hosted a debate in this chamber on nursery funding back in 2013, where I explained that one of the main reasons for the continuing rise in childcare costs is due to nursery providers having to cross-subsidise the free entitlement funding provided by the government. I stated then, Mr Bone, that while the government is the biggest procurer of nursery places, they are also the worst culprits when it comes to paying for the places they actually procure. And since that time, I'm sorry to say that little has changed. The consequence is that for years now, free provision has been subsidised by providers and parents due to a lack of adequate funding. Doubling the provision, Mr Bone, should benefit parents in my constituency and across the country. However, the danger of not implementing it properly is it will lead to a more expensive system, a more expensive childcare from the outset. And for these 3 hours, which could ultimately harm the very people and the policy is actually supposed to help, Mr Bone. The government has promised to include in the childcare bill a proposal to double free provision for 3- and 4-year-olds in England. The current allowance allows for 570 hours of free early education or childcare a year, which works out at 15 hours each week for the 38 weeks of the year. It is thought that up to 600,000 families could benefit from the doubling of this provision, saving as much as £5,000 a year. With this change due to come into force from September 2017, however, pilots, as has been already put forward by the Minister, will be talked about being brought forward earlier in September 2016. With 2 children of my own, Mr Bone, I'm fully aware of how expensive childcare can be, and I realise the cost of childcare is one of the biggest barriers the UK's 2 million single parents face to finding and staying in work. Therefore, Mr Bone, I want to make it absolutely clear that I very much welcome this policy and support this policy, but at the same time I want to raise a word of caution on the implementation and the impact that it could have on nursery providers. I've been approached by several nurseries in my constituency, Mr Bone, since the announcement in the Queen's speech, all of them keen to clarify what exactly this policy will mean for their businesses. Amongst them was the owner of Station House Day Nursery in Dunnington and Polly Ann's Nursery in Haxby. Both providers see the benefits of such a policy, but agree that the only way providers will be able to offer this increased number of hours is for the funding to cover the cost of provision, which in many areas it currently does not do, Mr Bone. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of visiting a number of nurseries in my constituency, from Little Green Rascals near Elvington, Sunshine Day Nursery in Huntington, Tiddlywinks in Osbaldwick, Quackers in Cotmanthorpe and Polly Ann's Nursery in Haxby, to name but a few. And having met with the owners of these nurseries and kept in contact with them over various funding issues, Mr Bone, it's absolutely clear that they do a tremendous job, carry out an essential service for parents and families, not just in my constituency but right across the country. However, this essential service is increasingly under threat as a direct result of the funding issues. As we all know, in the UK, parents receive help with their childcare through free early education. In England, central government allocates money to local authorities through the early years block of the dedicated school grant, with an estimated total spend of £2.2 million a year. However, there is a great disparity across the country in how much is spent on childcare by individual local authorities. And herein, Mr Bone, lies the problem. The National Audit Office found that free entitlement varied from £2.78 to £5.18 an hour, with the national average placed at £3.95 by individual local authorities. My constituency of York Outer receives only £3.38 an hour from the City of York Council. The sad truth of the matter is, Mr Bone, that funding for the 15 hours of free provision per week falls well short of the actual cost. To be precise, the shortfall runs at about £800 per child, which results in nurseries running at a loss for those 15 hours. Therefore, they have to subsidise that loss through the price of childcare outside of the free entitlement hours. My previous debate, Mr Bone, centred over these issues, and following the debate I was able to secure a meeting with the former Minister to raise these concerns face to face alongside a group of local nursery providers from York. The government has been aware of this problem now for some time, and I know the Minister who's in his place has been very proactive in discussions with nursery providers and again has met nursery providers from my constituency. And we are now starting to see some positive news come out, Mr Bone. This includes the announcement that my honourable friend will oversee a funding review of the entitlement due to start in the next few weeks. The Minister seems committed to raising the hourly funding rates paid to providers for places, which I warmly welcome. However, this review is being undertaken at a time when costs to nursery providers are set to increase further, with pension auto-enrolment responsibilities coming in for many small and medium-sized nurseries, and the pressure is only increasing where payment of funded hours is delayed, with over 40% of local authorities paying over a month after the term has started, when we all know the actual law requires them to pay within 30 days. On top of this, Mr Bone, I'm acutely aware that the burdens of business rates and VAT are continuing to push up the cost of childcare, which constrains the abilities of nurseries to offer more places. The average annual business rate paid by nurseries is almost £16,000, which is why I welcomed the DCLG's intervention in January this year in writing to all English local authorities to ask them to consider implementing business rate relief for childcare providers. Local authorities have had this power since the 2011 Localism Act, and the government will fund basically 50% of any discretionary relief schemes that councils introduce. Following this announcement, Mr Bone, I wrote to my own local authority, York City Council, asking them to consider implementing business rate relief to childcare providers in the area. They sadly refused. But interestingly, Mr Bone, when the Chief Executive addressed the NDNA conference earlier this month, she reported to her conference that she had also written to every local authority in England on this issue, but had been told that none would be actually implementing business rate relief for nurseries, which I find extremely disappointing. Mr Bone, whilst there is political differences over childcare policies, there is broad support for the current approach of both supply-side and demand-side subsidies. However, compared to many other developed countries, the public funding of childcare is complicated in the UK, to say the least. It's complex, it's expensive to administer for government, and it's complex for providers and the parents themselves. Therefore, I believe this policy to double free provision for 3- and 4-year-olds provides us with a perfect opportunity to launch a full review of childcare funding and to set in place the changes that ensure simplicity, progressive levels of support, quality, which is absolutely key in this field, and accessibility. Take-up of the current 15 hours of free provision for 3- to 4-year-olds is currently at 96%. However, for 2-year-olds, it's much lower. This is because some providers have opted actually out of the provision as they believe the hourly funding rate is not financially sustainable. Many nurseries operate a complex cross-subsidy mechanism, and they rely on working parents of 3- and 4-year-old children to purchase extra hours on top of their existing 15 hours of free provision. And I've made clear throughout this debate, Mr Bone, I have real sympathy with the providers regarding underfunding. And I hope that the upcoming funding review led by my honourable friend, the Minister, will bring meaningful reform. I fully believe that only quality provision helps narrow the gap between disadvantaged children and their peers. And as the owner of Pollyann's Nursery in Haxby, in my constituency, has stated, when he actually first opened his business, his nursery, back in the early 1990s, it was only doctors and accountants, he told me, could actually use it. And it was unusual for women to be actually going back to work. But now we have a flexible working. Free childcare has opened up daycare to a whole range of families. Doubling free provision will only add to this trend. However, I believe it can only be successful if it goes hand in hand with a full review of childcare funding. As I've mentioned, Mr Bone, money is allocated to local authorities through dedicated schools grants for 3- and 4-year-olds. The rate per pupil is largely determined by historical precedents. It is not based on the actual characteristics and the needs of the children. I believe early years funding should be brought closer in line with schools funding, which allocates money on the basis of a larger number of criteria, which includes pupil numbers, deprivation, attainment levels, to name a few. This would ensure funding being actually matched children's needs and the cost to providers for providing their early education. In addition to this, a national formula could be looked at which could consider 2 rates, one for London and one for the rest of England, similar to the way in which funding for 2-year-olds is formulated, which is fairer and more transparent. Local authorities receive a flat hourly rate per child of £4.85, supplemented by an area cost adjustment in places where wages are actually higher. This would be a much clearer funding system and would help to streamline the number of complex formulas currently in place. Overall, while childcare represents a significant outlay to parents, I think it's important to remember that childcare, by its very nature, will always be expensive, Mr Bone, and it's not fair to simply suggest that high childcare costs are the result of providers charging high fees to hard-pressed parents. The reality is much more complex than that. Childcare should never be provided on the cheap, and we must ensure that measures to make childcare more affordable do not compromise on its quality, which for me is absolutely crucial. Although successive governments have increased their help with childcare costs, parents in Britain are still paying a higher proportion of their income on childcare than most other developed countries. On top of this, some childcare providers struggle to even break even. All of this is indicative of a childcare system that is currently not working. Mr Bone, I view the proposals to double free childcare provision as an opportunity to fix these long-standing problems once and for all. We have a chance to make a real change to help not only nursery providers but parents who use these facilities. And I hope the government grasps it with both hands, and I'm encouraged from what I've heard from the Minister with our previous conversations so far on this issue. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House considered free childcare provision and nursery providers. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Bone, and I want to thank my honourable friend for giving us the opportunity to have this debate, which is very timely in the light of the government's commitment to doubling the amount of free childcare available for working families. I would also say, like him, I'm a father of a 14-month-old who does go to nursery, and so I experience what is happening in the childcare market from the point of view of a parent, not just a politician sitting in Westminster making decisions about the sector. His speech dwelt very much on the challenges that the nursery sector faces, but I would just like to start by countering that actually when we look at the childcare market, it is much broader than the nursery sector, although the private and voluntary and independent providers provide the vast majority of places. You've got childminders, you've also got school nurseries, and across those three groups, they provide the bulk of the formal childcare that the department is concerned about. And I think when we talk about the market and the challenges the market faces, it is important to recognise how broad the market is and also the different types of services that are offered in the market. So, for example, childminders offer childcare in a domestic setting, whereas nurseries obviously have to take your child there. It's more sort of an organisation. And therefore, the challenges and the opportunities that each provides to parents is slightly different. But all that said, we know that for many families with young children, childcare is just not an issue. It is the issue. Many parents want to go back to work or work more hours, but find that the cost of childcare can make that unaffordable. And this government wants to reward hardworking families by reducing their childcare bill. That said, policies are not just about the parents. We also recognise that childcare is very much about the child, and a lot of development happens in those early years. So the quality of childcare provision is as important as actually making childcare available. Which brings me to the key challenge we face in this sector. How do you make childcare affordable? How do you make sure that it is of a sufficient quality? But also, how do you make sure that it is available in the form that parents want to take it? Because every parent, the childcare needs of parents are not consistently the same across the board. Mr. Bone, I'll take the opportunity in responding to my honourable friend's comments to also make some general points about our childcare policy in general. And the first I'll say is that I am actually quite proud of our record to date. We are the first to fund 15 hours of free childcare for all 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as 40% of 2-year-olds. We've legislated to introduce tax-free childcare, which for those 1.8 million families who want to buy additional hours, and they can get up to £2,000 off per child per year. It's important that this applies for children from the age 0 through to 17 in the case of children with disabilities. So it's not only for childcare in the early years, but wraparound care, whether it's breakfast or after school clubs. Tax-free childcare can help parents with that as well. We've also increased the child element of tax credits and introduced shared parental leave. But we also need to do more to ensure that we're enabling families to make choices that are best for their circumstances. And in doing this, I think it's worth recognising, as my honourable friend implied throughout his speech, that in many cases it is businesses that are delivering these services for parents. And so we need to make sure that their funding is on a sustainable level. And that is why we've talked about implementing the funding rate for the new 15 hours, not just in a way that is fair, but also sustainable, but crucially to ensure that children have the best possible start in life with affordable, safe, and high-quality childcare. I mean, more broadly, our business and the economy depend on working parents, and those parents depend on access to high-quality childcare. Yet, what the Childcare and Early Years Survey tells us is that 22% of working parents have found it difficult or very difficult to pay for childcare. For lone working parents, this rises up to 38%, so there is a lot more that can be done. But the conundrum here is that the government already invests £5 billion per annum to support parents with childcare. So how can we be in a situation where we are spending over £5 billion, and yet some parents are still saying that they find the cost of childcare too expensive? The childcare bill, what it does is therefore takes the support that parents can get further and delivers on our manifesto commitment to support children at every stage of their life. In addition to the current entitlement of 570 hours for all 3- and 4-year-olds, we will be extending this so that, and I'm happy to report that the take-up of the existing entitlement in New York is already higher than average. With the new entitlement, working families will be receiving more childcare support than ever. That would guarantee them over about 1,140 hours of free childcare, worth over £5,000 a year per child. And I think what the comment I'd like to make here is obviously on the funding rate, which was a key part of my honourable friend's speech. That yes, we need to look at the funding rate for the first 15 hours as well as the funding rate for the second 15 hours. And I hear nursery providers in terms of their complaints that they have made. I think it's worth making it very clear, though, that the impact on the funding rate on a business is as a result of a number of factors, not just the rate, although the rate is important. So, for example, whether or not the local authority top slices the funding that goes from central government to providers, determines whether providers have more or less than the rate that central government is determining, but also the flexibility that local authorities allow providers to deliver the 15 hours is important, because if local authorities are quite inflexible in the scope for providers to allocate the 15 hours in a way that works best for their business, that would invariably also impact on their profitability. And thirdly, business model decisions that our operators make does impact on how far that money can go. So I think in looking at the sustainability of this, we need to look at all of those things in the round, as well as obviously focusing on the funding rate that is available. And to support the market beyond the funding rate, I worked with the Department for Communities and Local Government in the last Parliament, urging local authorities to both work with childcare providers and ensure charitable and non-profit providers are benefiting from business rate relief that they are entitled to. Any nurseries that are registered charities will already benefit from rate relief. The smallest providers, including childminders, benefit from small business rate relief, and although any further relief would require local authority discretionary relief. And I've heard what the Honourable Member said in terms of local authorities granting or not granting that relief. I intend to continue to work with the National Day Nurseries Association to find ways in which we can make sure that the action that is necessary here is taken to help reduce the cost of provision for childcare providers. So I understand where he's coming from, and will be taking action as he suggests. And that said, I just want to sort of countenance the idea, I'll just sort of counter the idea that somehow the childcare day market is not thriving. In fact, I would say it is the opposite. The childcare day market for 0 to 5 is actually vibrant and thriving. It has been reported that it's now estimated at £4.9 billion in that's 2013-2014 numbers, although 1/3, and that's about 1/3 larger than it was a decade ago in terms of number of places in the sector. The number of places has gone up by 12% and roughly 230,000 places were created between 2009 and 2015. I think those are signs of a sector that, whereas there are challenges, and we recognize the challenges, that the sector is rising very much to those challenges. And to help the sector meet those challenges, we're listening to inputs. The input from the sector, I have announced a review on the cost of providing childcare. That review is underway. I think there were over 300 responses within the first 24 hours or so. So it is very clear that the sector is aware and engaging with the call for evidence that has been announced. The review will report in the autumn, and I will encourage providers in New York and across the country to respond to that review. And as my honourable friend pointed out, it's not, and this touches on the point that I previously made, that it's not just about the funding rate, but also payment practices is an issue here for providers. I've heard that from all sorts of providers, including some of the largest providers in the sector. At present, the average that central government, so that is something that we will be looking at as well. At present, the average that central government pays local authorities per hour, I think, is about £4.51 for 3- and 4-year-olds. That is in excess of what he said providers in York, in his constituency, are receiving. In fact, this is higher, the rate that is, than the Family and Childcare Trust survey that shows that an average nurseries charge £4.47 per hour for children aged 2 and over. So I hope that indicates to him why we really need to look at what's happening between the rate that is set at central government, the rate that providers are receiving, why it differs so much from local authority to local authority, but also why it differs from type of provider to type of provider. And that is not to say that we do not accept that we need to look at the overall level of the rate, but I think it's not just the overall level of the rate, we need to look at these other aspects as well as the funding formula, which he touched on. There are historical inconsistencies with the current funding system for 3- and 4-year-olds, and that results in large variations in funding distribution across local authorities. There are also variations in the amount of funding that local authorities pass on to providers, as I have said. We started looking at this seriously in the last Parliament to create greater transparency for parents and providers. We now publish an annual benchmarking tool that lists every council's funding and how much they pass on for different providers. And this should help both parents and providers to have informed conversations with councils, but also hold them to account. And I'm confident that if we look at all of these seriously, that the extended entitlement will provide an opportunity for existing providers to expand. It should provide opportunities for new providers to enter the market and to provide choice for parents, but also help build our economy. The market is, as I said, healthy and growing, and I'm sure that my honourable friend will be interested to know that in York, 4 Children have developed a fantastic childcare hub with a blended childcare offer where schools, private, voluntary and independent providers are working together to provide high-quality childcare. Now, this is one example of innovation in the sector that can be used to boost capacity, high quality and flexibility for parents. And one thing I would say in general in response to his question is actually in order to be able to deliver for parents, but in a cost-effective way, we need more of such innovation rather than having a sector that operates within silos. My honourable friend talked about our nursery provision. We know that many maintained nursery schools deliver the highest quality early education, often in disadvantaged areas where this can make the greatest difference. I fully support these schools as they are delivering high quality, and we'll be looking to work to make sure that they, as well as our private and voluntary providers, can continue to thrive. I'm also proud to say that the quality of providers continues to improve. We know that in York, 91% of early years settings are rated as good or outstanding compared to 80% nationally, and that is a very encouraging statistic. Additionally, 64% of children in York achieved a good level of development in the early years foundation stage profile compared to 60% nationally in 2014. Mr. Bode, in conclusion, what I'd say is to my honourable friend, is the government's childcare policy, we know, will have a direct and significant impact on the lives of children and families across the country, that it is right that it is subjected to the most thorough scrutiny, as he has done.